I was born in Allahabad in North India in June of 1935. My father was working on the railways and he had come out to India as a very young man when his father, who was a regimental sergeant major in the Royal Horse Artillery, had one of his Indian tours of duty, which so many military units used to have in those days. He came out with his wife and 3 children. My father was the eldest. And my father loved India so much that when his parents went home, he asked to be left behind because his passion was the railways, and he'd managed to get himself apprenticed into a railway workshops where he did very well, and rather strangely his parents agreed that he stayed in India and corresponded with them. And being a Brit in a largely Anglo-Indian community, because the railways were dominated by Anglo-Indians, he made himself thoroughly at home in this sort of rather lower echelon of the Raj, because the Brits and the railways usually were in top management, and my father it was unusual to have an Englishman apprenticed and working as a locomotive designer in this almost entirely Anglo-Indian community. But he loved it, and he made great friends amongst the Anglo-Indians, and eventually he met my mother at a Railway Institute dance in Tundla, a place called Tundla, and apparently fell in love with her straight away, and was firmly resisted by my mother for a long time until her mother told her that she should marry him because he would improve the blood, which gives you some indication of how important it was to be anything but Anglo-Indian in those days. Anyway, I was the first progeny out of 3 sons, and I have no recollection of Allahabad because very shortly after my birth we moved, I think initially to Lucknow and then eventually to Jamalpur, where my brother Paul was born about 18 months after me. Jamalpur was the great railway base in Bihar, in eastern India. Kipling wrote about it. He had a long chapter on it in his one of his books, and how if you were not in the railways you really had no place or no reason to be in Jamalpur. It was that much of a railway city. It had suffered the consequences of a serious earthquake a year before I was born. The Bihar earthquake was one of the worst ever experienced in India, and Gandhi had deplored the great loss of human life, and they had managed to rebuild much of it by the time my father was posted there. I certainly wasn't aware of what that had involved because I was too young. But we grew up, I grew up, certainly my first 5 or 6 years were spent in Jamalpur. And then, following the pattern of so many other railway families, we began moving around from one railway station to another. They were generally cantonments, as they were described, because they were adjacent to military barracks. So you had this Anglo-Indian railway community, cheek and jowl with some military unit. And it led to some interesting anecdotes. I remember my grandfather telling me the story of one such cantonment railway station, where the Anglo-Indian station master used to wait for the cannon to be sounded on the hill in the military barracks so that he could set the station clock, which was always about 5 minutes slow. So he would set the hands of the station clock, and about 3 minutes later the commandant of the camp would arrive on his horse and check his watch with the station clock. So, as you might imagine, this particular cantonment began to slip further and further back into time. But yes, that was the basis of my upbringing, the railways, which still have a very large part in my affections, because I love railways. I've inherited my father's love of railways.
And looking back, how do you think that's affected your view of empire as well?
I don't know whether it was the railways that did it. I developed something of my father's love of Kipling and, you know, the importance of empire and Britain's role in setting a good example to other colonial powers. I was proud of, I was weaned on British history, and which was, you know, colonial history. My history of India, of course, was very distorted by the fact that it was written for the English public education system. And it wasn't until years later that I discovered heroes of Indian history like Tipu Sultan, you know, who resisted the British presence, quite rightly, and who fought them off in Mysore and died defending his kingdom at Seringhapatnam. And when I went there many years later, I was so impressed by the history of this extraordinary man who'd, you know, been such a hero of the Indians and who was vilified by the Brits because he opposed them. And so history can be very distorted. It depends who's writing it.
And what about your mother? Did she talk about her experiences in India to you at a later date?
Yes, she did. When she could still recollect them. She had a very strong family base in Tunla, where she grew up. She was from a family of 5 and a very close family. Her father claimed to be of Scottish descent, Arnold Watson, his name was, and he'd married Kathleen Maud Sturrock, whose family had been German and who I gathered had not taken well to the fact that her mother, Kathleen's mother, had married a man of mixed blood, in her case somewhat diluted blood, a man called Thompson. But as a result, the mother of Kathleen was kind of thrown out of the family, as I understand. And she was very young. She was only about 15 when she married my grandfather. But it was love at first sight and remained so in all the years that they lived together. She was an extraordinarily strong woman. She had a magnetic personality. She was very petite, a little bit dark, but immensely intelligent. Great reader of books, musician, painter. In this tiny little railway community where there couldn't have been more than about 200 families, she set about establishing a theatre and, you know, running the latest Cole Porter and Jerome Kern musicals, with her family all taking part. Quite a remarkable woman. She wrote a novel about an incestuous relationship between a brother and sister, which was very forward for its time. Never got published. She was barred by the Calcutta Statesman eventually from submitting any more entries into their weekly crossword puzzle, because she was winning them all. I still have somewhere her annotated dictionary, which she used. It was her faithful companion. But when she became annoyed by the school teacher in the primary school, I'd been sent to a railway primary school, she convinced my parents that she would do a better job of educating me. So she took my brother and myself under her wing. She equipped her little railway bungalow, miles away from where my parents lived, with school desks, school books and textbooks and a blackboard, and gave us a really rigorous education, almost one-on-one, one-on-two really. And she was extremely strict. I remember smarting from her ruler raps on my knuckles, and then she'd disappear into the bedroom, and we knew she was crying her eyes out for having to do this. You know? But she was a lovely person, and I missed her enormously when she died very young, because she reached a point where she couldn't educate us anymore. Her health was suffering, so we were sent off to boarding school. And shortly after our admission, I heard she died. It was a huge shock. She was only 52. So yes, she was fundamental to my life, and she was basically the most important person in my life. I mean, we spent more time with her than we did with our own parents, because she was suffering the empty nest syndrome. Her own children had grown up, and I was the eldest of the next generation. So I was kind of her darling, I suppose, and she wanted to rear me herself, which she did.
Can you tell me about the education that you received from her?
Well, I thought it was very good. It was very balanced. I mean, we did all the subjects, sort of chemistry, I think. I don't remember any test tubes and that sort of thing, but it was quite well-rounded. I mean, she was educating herself in the process, sort of working out the prospectus for the following day. She really labored over this, and intensely. And it was so good that I sailed easily through my subsequent years. I went to St. Xavier's School. Mind you, competition was fierce in India, because you're in classes with aspiring young Indians who are immensely ambitious and whose whole lives depend on how well they can do. Whereas in my case, of course, it didn't seem to be that important. So I was falling behind in grades, but it wasn't her fault. I mean, she at least got me into those classes. And in fact, when we eventually came to England in 1946, I got a scholarship into grammar school on the basis of primarily the education I'd received from my grandmother, which helped a lot.
You mentioned also that there was a small railway community wherever you went. Did you get a sense of what that was like as a child? Was it quite close-knit, for example?
Very close-knit, yes. We knew all the families. We were invariably all Anglo-Indian, with the exception of the few top management Brits who lived in a separate part of the cantonment, and kept to themselves. But we had a great time. It was a marvellous way to grow up. My only frustration was the fact that we were living in our own little bubble world. We weren't part of Greater India, We considered ourselves apart from the unwashed masses. And that frustrated me, because I wanted to go out and explore. I'd read Kipling, and I wanted to be part of India, But this was strongly disapproved. I wasn't allowed to go wandering off into the native quarter, as it were. We were chaperoned by our own servants, and given firm instructions as to where we could and couldn't go. And that frustration, I think, has led to this subsequent yearning to see more of the real India.
Do you think there was a kind of very particular Anglo-Indian identity that was quite separate from the British and from the Indians?
There was, but the irony was that we all desperately tried not to be Anglo-Indian. We all, the stigma of racial impurity in those days was very strong. Touch of the tar brush and things like that. So, of course, when we eventually left India, there was no point in pretending amongst ourselves. But when we scattered in the great diaspora that took place when partition and independence were looming in 1947, we all tried desperately to settle into our chosen adoptive communities as, natives, Englishmen or Australians or Canadians, or adopt the camouflage of the country that had taken us in. And we were reluctant to actually acknowledge that we were Anglo-Indian. In fact, one of the funniest things that happened to me when I published my autobiography was the reaction from some of my family, who were shocked not by the fact that I'd admitted to being gay, but the fact that I was admitting to being Anglo-Indian. They refuted this. Even now, I have an aunt in Australia who strongly resents the fact that I said I'm Anglo-Indian.
So why do you think that was? Was it because of the stigma attached to it in colonial India?
It certainly was. And I think they were this determination to claim their British inheritance or Scottish inheritance was so strong that they actually convinced themselves that they were pure-blooded Canadian or Australian or Scottish or whatever. And they weren't deceiving. They were deceiving themselves. They were in denial, I suppose. Whereas I kind of chose to fly this flag vigorously. I was proud of being Anglo-Indian. I thought, when I got to England, I didn't want to be just another Englishman, I wanted to be different. And I had the first class opportunity to be so by claiming to be Anglo-Indian. Which of course would provoke stupid questions like, did I live in a wigwam or a hut or something? But, I cast those aside, and I never found any difficulty in acknowledging my Anglo-Indian inheritance. But I was of a different generation. I was of that younger generation, and the world was changing. After the war, the world was changing. You saw the beginnings of the great tides of population, the refugee populations, the tidal movements that have changed the nature of the world. No country now can claim to be intact and to have its population unsullied by other races. We're all a mixed up world now, and so it was easier after the war, and it's become progressively easier since.
Can you remember what was the attitudes like in your community towards Indian independence and partition?
One of acute anxiety, I think, because we knew that the only world we'd known up to then was going to change. Quite rightly, the Indians were asserting themselves. They wanted India to be Indian. And we suspected that we would suffer, we would find it hard to adjust. A lot of people did stay on, and there is still quite a large Anglo-Indian community, and many of them are still in the railways. But nearly all of my immediate circle migrated. We all left. My father could see no future in staying on in India. So there was this tremendous diaspora, really. Mainly, in the case of my family, mainly to Britain. Some went to Australia, where I still have a large family of friends and relatives. some to Canada. But yes, there was a belief that the India we knew was ending, and it would never be the same. Since writing these books, I have met Anglo-Indians who stayed on in India and who've told me that they went the other way. They chose to make themselves more Indian, where we were striving to make ourselves more fitted for our adoptive communities. They wanted to blend into the new India. And many of them changed their names, and their children married into Indian families, so that they consider themselves more Indian now than Anglo-Indian.
Peter, what do you think are your strongest kind of sensory memories from India, like smells or sounds or visually?
Gosh, they can come back so quickly, you know. Some spice or aroma can suddenly recall and flash. I loved it. I lapped it up. I especially loved travelling on the railways, because the journeys are quite long. It would take, I think, a couple of nights to go from, say, Calcutta to Bombay. And you'd be stopping at little wayside halts where you'd hear the bustle and commotion of tea sellers, and their calls of garam cha, you know, these little earthenware cups in which they sold their hot tea. It was full of atmosphere. I just loved leaning out of the window or pulling up the blinds from my bunk at night and seeing all that activity on the platform, and wondering what world lay beyond that platform, you know, what other community lay beyond there. Yeah, I loved India. I felt as if a large part of me had been left behind when we left India. I was 11, and I have to tell you, I was not impressed with Britain. I was surprised at the smallness of it. I'd expected some awe-inspiring sense of being in the motherland of this huge empire, you know, where everything was big somehow and grand, and it wasn't. It was shabby, and, you know, post-war 1946, post-war austerity England was a very sorry-looking place. Dark and dismal, people with ration books, struggling to get their lives back together again. I remember our ship arrived at Liverpool, where the people I understood were called Lilliputians, and I mixed them up with the people in Gulliver's Travels, those little people who tied Gulliver down. And I thought, yes, they are small, aren't they? Oh, that's stupid. And the other shock was, of course, seeing white men labouring, you know, doing manual, menial work. Something I had never been prepared for. It was a completely different world. But basically, everything seemed small. The railway carriages were small. The countryside was like a counterpane, you know, everything tiny and beautiful, but petite. No vistas anywhere, no grandness, no spacious horizons. Everything looked cramped. And I was hugely disappointed. I had expected something much more awe-inspiring.
And how about your family? How did they assimilate back into British life?
Badly. We went to stay with my father's father, who, as I mentioned, was a retired sergeant major, regimental sergeant major from the Royal Horse Artillery, and who had been a martinet of a man all his life. His whole family had feared him, and I think one of the reasons my father had run away to the railways was because he was in awe of his father. And it was a very strange thing. I now recognize that my grandfather was actually jealous of my father's career in India, because my father had done very well. He'd become extremely successful. He was the head of his, locomotive design work in Kanchapara, and that was a very big railway workshop. So, amazingly, he did what most fathers would never dream of doing. He tried to put my father down and lower his self-esteem and tell him that there was not much future for him in England because everything he'd done in India was of no consequence. And he'd better pull his socks up and sort of make a fresh start. And he so demoralized my father that my father actually ended up with a nervous breakdown. Something for which I've never forgiven my grandfather. Because my father was a very bright man and he could have done so much more, but he lost all his self-confidence as a result of that. And we therefore found it extremely hard to manage. My father was out of a job. He turned up the very offer that had brought us back to England. It was an excellent job up north in Newcastle. And he went up there and was so shocked by conditions in Newcastle, he came back and told my mother we couldn't possibly live there. And he was out of work for a long time. We were scraping pennies. We were running out of his savings very rapidly. I remember in Hastings, we'd often not have enough pennies for the gas meter to finish cooking the food. So I knew poverty, I used to stuff cardboard into my shoes because there were holes in my soles, and I didn't want my mother to have to buy new shoes, so I would walk to school on cardboard soles. I think it was a good thing. It taught me frugality, and mind you, once I actually started earning money, I threw all that overboard and became a terrible spendthrift. But I don't regret those years. They were salutary years. Yeah.
And when did you move down to Hastings with your family?
Well, we left my grandfather fairly soon because we realized there was no point in continuing to see my father suffering like this. So we went to Southend initially to occupy a house that had been let by an uncle, my mother's brother, Trevor. And he'd just left to go up north to Liverpool. So we took over their house in Southend. Not Southampton. Did I say Southampton? It wasn't Southampton. It was Southend-on-Sea.
Yeah.
And I went to school there. Again, I had to be tested. I'd missed the grammar school scholarship exams, but the headmistress was sufficiently caring to allow me to take them belatedly in the privacy of her office, and I passed. And she was, she formed a great attachment for me, and was very sorry to see us leave. When we went to Hastings because we understood it was warmer down south, by about 50 miles. And we had another relative there who was singing the praises of Hastings. So we moved in with them initially, and then got a house of our own in St. George's Road, which is where I lived, I suppose, from the age of 12 till the time I left England, 10 years later, 22. A little terrace house in a scruffy working class area of Hastings. But it saw many comings and goings of family, and so many of my relatives remember it with affection because it was a base for their travels. They always came to see us. And yes, we had happy years there.